I'm imagining us having thousands of portfolio companies basically in the Animoca ecosystem. We look at Web3 as essentially this giant network effect, which we can now own. Our philosophy is that we think that Web3 represents this new asset class, which is representations of network effects.
Good morning, Avery. So nice to see you. I hope you had a lovely holiday weekend. I know this is going to come out, I think, a few days after, but it's really the official start of fall. So no more summertime. What are you into?
It is definitely giving back to school season. I feel like this week after Labor Day through Christmas, through like December 20th is always the busiest time of year, at least on the agency side. We've got a lot of campaigns launching, just a lot of things happening. So I'm excited. I'm feeling like it was a great summer and ready to get into it. And also very ready for our incredible guest today, which is one I know we've been eagerly anticipating.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that in a second. But first, a couple stories I think I just wanted your opinion on, Avery. Number one is, we keep seeing these areas where people are being challenged about whether they will allow AI to be involved in creative processes. So there is, I'm sure you know, a National Novel Writing Month. It happens to be right now. And this contest is under fire right now because they are allowing the use of AI in the process. And they're actually citing ableism and privilege as reasons, in the sense that, according to their statement, they said not all writers have the financial ability to hire humans to help at certain phrases of their writing. For some, the decision to use AI is practical. I thought that was an interesting way to put it, which is, hey, we don't want to take AI out of the mix because people might use it for things like grammar or like checking sentence structure and that kind of stuff, where a typical editor might be able to be involved. But it also opens the door for me to write an entire novel with AI. So they're coming under some fire for this. But I guess I just wanted to get your reaction to the idea of, when you think of something like National Novel Writing Month, did we invite the robots to write novels?
This is really interesting, Sam. I was not aware there's a National Novel Writing Month, but happy September. I love it. I actually really like that take. I think that AI is a practical tool for folks who don't have access to editors. And I like that that's their defense. The reality is the door is already open. And how are they really going to fully police that? They're going to police that by using an AI to read the AI written things. And it's not going to be 100% perfect. The door is open. The genie is out of the bottle. That's my take. And I think the schools and folks who are trying to clamp down on any use of AI will not be successful, just because it's like when you were trying to tell kids you can't have your cell phone in these places and they just put it in their pocket, they hide it under their leg, whatever it is. The genie is out of the bottle. And I think at this point, it's more how you can be leveraging AI to help your process versus writing an entire novel with AI is going to be obvious, at least at this state. It might not be completely in the future, but at this state, it would be obvious. So I actually kind of like that take. And I think it's an inevitability more than anything.
I think that's the right way to look at it. And I think the more we make it an analogy to how there are tools within Google Docs that help you get your grammar correctly or like might finish your words, this feels like we should be looking at it through the lens of helper applications. I mean, I know in your top 5 of books, you had Scott Galloway's Algebra of Wealth. He very openly talks about how he uses AI very much to do things like source facts for him. He goes back and checks, but he's like, a lot of the things that I get out of it are about starting points for me. And then he's obviously has a team as well. But I do think that I like how he is unapologetic about this thing is a helper tool for me, and I'm going to use this tool. So
Absolutely.
I think it makes sense as well. I think if I was a budding novelist, maybe I don't want to go up against ChatGPT, but really it's, to your point, you, the human, should be able to write the better novel. So bring your A game.
Absolutely. And this is a little bit of an aside, but actually one of my sisters got her PhD in Victorian literature. And just to be able to do that and to take 20 years of your life to dedicate to that takes a certain amount of financial privilege that just most people don't have. And that's why I especially really like that point, around leveling the playing field a little bit, because there's one, like access to incredible lengths of higher education, which is amazing. And I'm a huge proponent of, but I'm also realistic that most people just don't have access to that. And on the other side of that is you have this generation of young writers who want to do this either as a passion project or something like that. And if this is a thought partner to help them, then more power to them. We actually have ChatGPT blocked at our organization, which I learned because I was putting in something to ChatGPT and I texted our COO and I was like, oh, did we block ChatGPT? It seems like we did. He was like, yeah, what are you using it for? And I was like, I was going to use it for just like a quick mock-up. Anyway, so it's funny because I understand the need for organizations to sort of clamp down on this. And it makes sense because there's so many ways it can go wrong. But on the flip side, I truly believe it is inevitable. And the best thing we can do is give sort of guardrails for responsible use.
It's so funny you say that. We also have it blocked. And with Bullish, our parent company being a financial organization, they are actually, part of it is them being worried about what is being fed in to
Yes.
ChatGPT, and that we have a lot of sensitive information here that we manage, and they can't have that in a third party. So they built their own version only on our data where it is not being fed back to OpenAI itself. So I think that actually the fact that both of us are using it in two very different industries also shows there's still a lot of challenge in AI usage, and especially around rights. All right, next story, Avery, is we are seeing yet again another big tech platform CEO come under fire. So we talked about Pavel and Telegram being arrested in France. The next one right now is a dispute that Elon Musk is having with the Supreme Court of Brazil, where basically they have banned X from being used in Brazil. And what they have cited is that one, which I thought was an astounding fact, that Twitter X does not have a company representative that can speak for the company in Brazil itself. There's 200 million people who live there. It's a very popular app there, but there is no one person that if the government wants to say, hey, can we have a conversation about what's going on? There's no one there. So that is one thing that's required. You need a representative in a major country, according to Brazilian Supreme Court. And then what they also want is some moderation on the opportunity for things like fake misinformation, fake news, and also how it's being politically gamed. And so they said, if we have no way to think about how to throttle those, especially when we know they're fake, then this is a problem for us. We'd like you to build some tools. And now Elon and his, the folks who follow him are really making this a free speech issue as opposed to sort of a business unit issue, because Instagram and Meta and TikTok, a lot of the other platforms are there and have compliance. It's just that Elon doesn't with X. And now he's making this into a much bigger story. But it just made me wonder if, we're starting to see the sort of social platforms under fire a little bit, and really governments are the antagonists right now in these. Any thoughts?
One, I'm not surprised at all that Twitter doesn't have a representative in Brazil. Another personal side, I actually lived in Sao Paulo for a bit when I was working at Google, and they had more than one person there. There was a whole army of people, both Brazilian sort of media executives and also sort of Google OGs, building up that office because it's a huge market for Google, as it is a huge market for Twitter. Brazil is a huge advertising market. And there are some particular rules and laws around the way that the media companies function with the media agencies. It's not necessarily standard in the Western world. So it's interesting that they probably use a channel partner model or some kind of a reseller model, if I had to guess. I think that Elon Musk is not making too many friends with advertisers at the moment. But let me put this on the other side. The people who are actually losing from this are the Brazilian people who now can't use X. And I'm sure they used it for water cooler talk and things like that. So I'm curious if there'll be some type of joint venture channel partner who steps in to take more of a lead role in this market, which has also been done before.
Yeah, well, let's keep our eye on it. I just hope Zuck doesn't, make his way to any of these countries. I think we're seeing the CEOs coming under fire, and
yes.
social seems to be the target for a lot. So more to come there. And then I guess my final thing, Avery, was, we didn't talk about this when it was announced about a week and a half ago. There was this Wells notice that was sent to OpenSea about NFTs being securities. Now, anyone who's been on OpenSea has seen most of what has been transacted on OpenSea are photographs that NFT artists have taken, 8-bit gorillas, or, other types of sort of just pictures. They're being deemed the potential of being a security, these NFTs. And I guess I keep going to, if that is the judgment, then how are sneakers and watches and vinyl toys and virtually any collectible not a security, if the idea is, well, you're trading something on OpenSea with the idea you're going to get financial compensation that's more than you spent on the way in, on the way out. So I just didn't know if you have any thoughts on what the Wells notice did, but really about the idea is like, can NFTs be art as security?
They'll be taken in a slightly different direction. When people like sell things on different collectibles marketplaces, whether it's Whatnot or eBay, they bought it for one price, they're selling it for another. Sometimes that's a gain, sometimes that's a loss. I think the idea of like secondary sales marketplaces is one that, there is plenty of precedent for it. Let me just put it that way. So I won't opine on the legal side of things, but there is certainly plenty of precedent on this. If you look at any type of sneaker collector or art collector, they buy it for one price, they sell it for another. Often that's transparent. Sometimes it isn't. And that's been going on for a very long time. I don't know why digital collectibles should necessarily be different.
What this makes me think about is the ticket marketplaces, right? Ticketmaster, TicketWeb, all of those.
Mm-hmm.
When something like a Taylor Swift or a big artist goes on sale, immediately many of those tickets are snapped up and then start going into the resale ecosystem. What that industry seems to be cracking down on is not the resale part. They're cracking down on the scalping part, as in they don't get to control the redistribution. So they're cracking down on the sort of the local scalper or the bot farms that come and snap up these tickets. But I guess just interesting to me that when a Taylor Swift ticket comes out at $150 and then very soon is available for $400, for $500, for $800, it's hard to look at that and not say that math can't be applied to what's happening on OpenSea with a lot less success because there's a lot fewer Taylor Swifts in the NFT ecosystem these days. But I just keep wondering how, if everything becomes a trading market, then everything is a security or nothing is a security. And going after specifically NFTs when they've already gone after the programs like Stoner Cats that we saw last year, it just makes it feel a little narrow in my opinion. So I hear you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm not a lawyer, but I guess my perspective, unrelated to Vayner, is that this idea of secondary marketplaces have happened forever. You just mentioned it with tickets. We talked about it with other forms of collectibles. And why is digital anything different that needs to be treated as a security?
Yeah, exactly. All right, Avery, let's get to our guest. Our guest is Yat Siu. Yat is an amazing thinker in the space. He's the chairman of Animoca Brands. He really brings a perspective of someone who has led investment for a long time, has built companies for a long time in the space, also comes out of Web2 technology. So I think also it has a good, unique perspective. And is sort of one of the people who is looking at this at a global level also. He really is, they're based in Hong Kong, but really looking at that region and what's happening there, but also how much bigger it's getting all across the globe. So with that, we will come back with Yat Siu. All right, welcome back. We are here with Yat Siu. Yat is the chairman, founder of Animoca Brands. He's a prolific investor and speaker on all things Web3. Blockchain has a deep history in tech that we'll also get into, but just wanted to welcome Yat to the show. So good to see you. And how are things going?
Great to be here. Thank you for having me. It's great. I'm here at WebEx, which is essentially, I guess, the Japanese Web3 event at the moment. Just about to kick off essentially a Web3 world tour ranging from Korea Blockchain Week, Token 2049, and it's just, go from here on out. So yeah, doing well and excited about the space.
Are you based in Asia or you're just spending a lot of time there?
No, I'm based in Hong Kong, although I could say I generally live on a plane most of the time, but sure. Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong is home. And so this isn't too far away, although, October is going to be like, Middle East, Dubai, and I guess Europe.
And then back to Hong Kong for consensus in February, I hope.
Well, we'll definitely not miss consensus. I mean, I think it's a special moment for really the region to have consensus be hosted here. And I think it is somewhat reflective of the times we're in that consensus is having its sort of marquee event actually in Hong Kong.
All right, we're going to talk all about that. But first, Yat, I would love if you could just give us a little bit about what you were doing before Animoca, before the blockchain, because when I was like really going into your history, I mean, you've done a lot of really interesting things in tech. And I thought it would be great for our audience, who a lot of whom are in kind of the Web2 technology, to just understand your trajectory prior to blockchain and then what got you into it.
Sure. So I'm going to try to condense it since my tech history really started since the 80s. So I actually, my first job was with Atari, the actual sort of early iterations of Atari when they were still doing the VCS 2600, although I was working in the computer department, which is the Atari ST, making originally multimedia music software when I was basically literally a kid. But what I think the relevant part of that is that I got that job when I actually was doing essentially sort of uploading my software on this early piece of software, this early piece of a pre-internet service called CompuServe. And that was actually where I found my community. And they didn't really care how old I was or the fact that I was a minority in Europe or any of that kind of stuff. They just cared about the code I wrote and that there was value from that. And then back then there was no PayPal. So they would literally send you checks in the mail. And that was kind of how I sort of that's the beginning, I guess, of my sort of tech career. And really the early days of the internet took me from Atari basically to the US. That's where I really started getting involved with the internet. My first online game was a multi-user dungeon, which is basically, imagine an online game, but it's purely based on text. And so if you kind of navigate from one room to another, you literally type in, go west, go north, that type of stuff. Like it's like, imagine like reading a book, just typing out essentially your instructions. I mean, that's kind of what the early forms of multi-user dungeons were like. And then, I moved to Asia through a series of
I just want to stop you for a second.
Yeah.
Avery, were you ever on CompuServe?
Sam,
you look too young. You look too young.
You love ribbing me about this. No,
this is not being.
I know what it is, but yes,
I just want you to understand. If I was like sending Yat an email on CompuServe, it would be like 47492.16722 at CompuServe.com. Like everyone was completely anonymous on the CompuServe.
Yes, everyone was a number. Everyone was a number.
Yeah. And that comes full circle in your journey in some ways, right, Yat?
It does.
Yes.
It does. Because I think to me, and I think maybe the fact that I grew up as a minority in Austria, in Europe, the fact that I found actually a community online that was essentially uncaring about my background or my age, really, because I was a kid, was actually what drew me into the space, right? And it kind of was quite meritocratic if you think about it, right? It was like, hey, if you had something of value and you could deliver something, I didn't care about anything else. I just cared about the fact what you could offer, and I respected your opinion simply based on your merit, right? Mm. And that's actually something that the sort of, I guess you could say, quasi-anonymity provided people at the time. And we weren't anonymous for being anonymous sake. It was just the fact that I didn't know who you were. I don't have a name. I don't, know that. I can just judge you based on the quality of your work. And I think that was kind of attractive. And that's how I got my job at Atari. And then, when I went to the US, though, I discovered a whole new world because the internet basically was already starting. I was actually using Mosaic, the Mosaic browser. This was sort of pre-Netscape, which of course Mark Andreessen was, famously sort of involved in before, his venture capital career. At SGI, basically, I was working on products related to VRML, which stands for Virtual Reality Markup Language. So VRML was basically a VR version of HTML. And it was actually pretty terrible because it was literally, imagine sort of building environments where it looked worse than Tron, the movie, in terms of the visuals. However, people imagined back then that we're basically going to be shopping and experiencing things in a virtual reality mode. But this was basically in the early 90s. So the vision was there, the technology just wasn't. And here we are today, whether it's the metaverse, whether it's basically VR goggles, AR, or even these sort of, multiplayer online games, they're all actually sort of representing that vision back in the 90s. So in a way, I would say for me, sort of this whole journey that I'm experiencing right now is really just an iteration of the history that was already evolving. As far as I'm concerned, the metaverse gave birth in the 80s. And it was just really slowly evolving over time. And really, to me, what we're seeing today with Web3, I think it's kind of maybe the metaverse is becoming an actual reality that is meaningful to people. Whereas before, it was really more an experience, but it wasn't something we could really sort of create value from, which is now different because of sort of the property rights angle. Anyway, long story short, I've had a sort of a career of starting several startups. My last business I sold to IBM, which became part of Lotus Notes, in the email space. I saw the iterations of the internet evolve in different countries. So having basically built tech businesses, in the basically 90s and then 2000 and obviously 2010s, I sort of saw that entire evolution of Web 1, Web 2. So to me, Web 3 is a little bit like history repeating itself. And sort of with the benefit of hindsight, how would I navigate the space knowing what I know from the past? And that's kind of how Animoca Brands was born. But we were a video game company. And that sort of, because after we sold the business to IBM, we had a non-compete on enterprise. And interestingly enough, actually, we were a leader in messaging at the time. That became part of Lotus Notes. And so I went back to our roots of video games. And this was around sort of 2009. And at that point, the App Store was just emerging. And so we basically became one of the largest mobile game developers on the App Store on Apple. And for those who may not remember or know, we actually had 12 out of the top 20 apps in 2011, early 2012. And then Apple removed all of our apps overnight in 2012, early. They didn't tell us exactly why. They just said for violations, okay, whatever that is. And that was sort of our big experience of what the world has suddenly come from. And I came from an open source background from the early days of the web. And then seeing what happened in Web 2, that was sort of a wake-up call to say, wait a second, what just happened there? And so I would say sort of the inspiration of going towards a path where we weren't dependent on platforms that were essentially running the web like a dictatorship was what drew us into blockchain. But we really only understood its potential when we got involved with CryptoKitties in 2017. Because we didn't come from the Bitcoin sort of narrative, which was very financial in nature, store of value. It didn't appeal to us as much. But NFTs to us represented cultural properties, which essentially is an intellectual kind of property right. And as a gamer and people in the gaming space, that just made a lot of sense. So that appealed to us a lot. And so in 2018, we pivoted Animoca Brands, which is a gaming company. It still is, but entirely into what's now known as Web3. But in 2018, we didn't call it Web3. It was just blockchain and NFTs and sort of crypto. But really, it was our major pivot into Web3. And people know us for our investments. The reason we did the investments were really twofold. The first one was that we were new to the space. So the best way to learn was basically sprinkle around some cash and get to meet some people, right? That's one way to do it, which kind of was inspired by my own angel investing history. I was a prolific angel investor actually during the sort of early days of the internet, which was quite successful for me personally. So we kind of just pursued a similar version of that strategy in Web3. But then the second thing was that we came to this conclusion that you can't have a true monopoly in Web3 as you can in Web2. It's not possible because networks are permissionless by nature. It's much more like open source. And so if you can't actually build a monopoly, which is something we don't want to do anyway, then the best way is to participate in the ecosystem broadly, we thought. And so that's part of the reason we also have this investment philosophy, which is kind of, on one hand, the critics will say, well, isn't that just spray and pray? But from our perspective, that's like building an economy. It's an ecosystem, right? You need all parts to succeed. And so we need to invest broadly in the space, which is kind of how we did that. And that's how we grew as a business. And so far, it's worked out quite well for us as both a business operator, with platforms like Sandbox or Mochaverse or Open Campus, and also, of course, as a prolific investor today at over 540 portfolio companies.
Just 540, Yat?
Well, a bit more, but yes. For me, I think the vision that we hope to have is that in the coming years, I'm imagining us having thousands of portfolio companies basically in the Animoca ecosystem. And that's because we look at Web3 as essentially this giant network effect, which we can now own. That's our philosophy, is that we think that Web3 represents this new asset class, which is representations of network effects.
Absolutely. Well, Sam and I share a lot of those views. So we're really excited to jump in, hear your thoughts on blockchain, on NFTs, on sort of the state of Web3 and gaming in particular. As you mentioned, Animoca is really the leader of that space. But in a more timely question, we did notice that you've tweeted out a few recent thoughts on the arrest of the founder of Telegram, who is also a well-known supporter of decentralization and of the network effects you just mentioned.
Yes.
How are you kind of feeling about that situation currently?
Well, I think obviously mixed feelings. Frankly speaking, I think it's a bad look for France. And it's actually somewhat a sort of signal to the sign of the times we live in, where someone like Pavel actually would get arrested in really what does look like a little bit of a surprise scenario, right? You can't sort of make the assumption that this is something that was just on a whim. Oh, by the way, this guy just landed. Let's do something, right? This obviously is something that was planned to some degree. And from what I can tell from the legal readings, it is not at this moment clear that Pavel himself is the target, but rather it's operators that are doing stuff on his platform or the platform he helped build, and they want information, and they've obviously, in the name of freedom and privacy, have not revealed this information and are now trying to potentially coerce it out of him through that, maybe, right? So these are some speculations, but it is concerning that I think governments in the world can do that. Remember, Telegram was hailed as a freedom-loving application that help people in Ukraine and other places around the world against those that are oppressed. And now suddenly it's like, okay, well, we have a sort of, it sounds a little bit like a double standard of, well, it's oppression over there, but it's not oppression when we do it, for instance, right? That's kind of one issue. But I think the positive, and I tend to be an optimist about all sorts of things, is that I think it's really shed a spotlight on the value of decentralization and actually what's going on in the space. And I actually think that first, we are Ton's largest validator, and we have a pretty big position in Ton ourselves, obviously, because we believe in what they do. And we also always said that we thought that Ton Telegram is essentially the mass onboarder for Web3, at least in the near to midterm. And we've seen this already with our own applications as well as with other sort of platforms out there. So we thought that was critical. But also, I think the need for essentially having a blockchain like Ton, which decentralizes the infrastructure, shall we say, becomes ever more critical. Because if we can get to a point where, for instance, let's say people have an issue with Ethereum, which some people have had issues with, or might still have, who knows, depending on which jurisdiction we talk about, right? Who do you arrest? Who do you go after, right? So again, that's actually one of the sort of powers of this, because I think one of the narratives that we don't speak enough about, but I think is very relevant in Web3 is, I think there's a movement towards decentralization. But why? Because we seek privacy, we want freedom, and we want property rights, and we want to have essentially sovereign rights over what belongs to us, which includes not just assets, but also our right to our privacy, right? That's actually something sovereign too. And in a way, when governments do what they do, I think it highlights it. And this discussion isn't just about Ton and Telegram, right? It's about, wait a second, what's actually happening with our data? Could this be a wake-up call for companies to say, and for individuals to say, hold on a second, maybe there's something much more deeper that we need to be looking at? Because remember the early days of the internet, pre 9/11 and Project Carnivore and that type of stuff, actually the type of freedoms that we had online or generally was expected. And so slowly as time went on, they've encroached on it in the name of, we have to fight terrorism and do all that kind of stuff. And while those are all very relevant reasons, and we should absolutely not discount them, there's an encroachment of, okay, you said you're using it for that, but are you in fact using it for that? And so this is the thing. And everyone obviously has arguably good intentions, but then once you get that power, which we've seen, that's the sort of this famous old adage of absolute power corrupts absolutely. Once you get access to that fire hose, then suddenly you start using it for things perhaps that you shouldn't be, right? And I think that's really what we need to protect. So my prediction is that I think Telegram is going to grow as a result of that, because I think the West, the US is an example where most people don't even know Telegram because it's still very much a WhatsApp society, whereas in Asia, it's quite well known. So in Asia, it's a bit of dismay. But I think in America, it's curiosity. It's like, oh, Telegram, interesting. What's that?
No such thing as bad PR. I like that take.
Yeah, so I actually think they're going to grow. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on Ton as well. And, the launch of Dogs actually was, I think, to me, an interesting bellwether of that ecosystem is actually growing. And, the recent issue that Ton had was the load it had. It wasn't actually related to anything around, despite all the speculation around Pavel, right? I mean, Pavel's not out there handling the switches. I mean, what a ridiculous thing for people to say, right? But anyway, that's the, so to me, it's just proof that actually the ecosystem is growing as a result of that. So I think that's good. I think it's I wish he wasn't in the situation he was in, but I think this news puts it really into everyone's attention that, we need to take our privacy, security, and property rights very seriously online.
So hot take is this will probably help Telegram in the long run. Short term, probably not the greatest for Pavel, but he'll figure it out.
The arrest happened as he got off his private jet, right?
Correct. That's what I understood as well. That's right. Yeah.
So we don't feel like so bad for him, but we do feel bad.
Right.
Okay,
and whatever his workout routine is, I need to do that because he also looks amazing. All right. I want to switch gears though. Yeah. So I feel like Avery and I have been doing the show for 2 years. We have been talking about the possibility and potentiality of NFTs and Web3 for the entire time of the show as one of the areas we focus on. Big brands coming in, small startups becoming big brands with Yuga, etc. It does seem like there's some people who are kind of feeling a lot of doubt right now about both the state of Web3 gaming and just the state of like NFTs in general. I don't think you share that, is my guess. So I would just love to, you to talk about your framing of where you think we are in the timeline, really for those who are having this sense of doubt and feeling like, oh, I invested all this money or I put all my time in and now what did I get out of it?
So first, I think as any new technology evolves, and whether this is called AI, whether this is VR, whether this is AR, there's a cycle, right? And there's a cycle that is obviously met with a lot of hype and attention. And then there's a dying down. That doesn't mean that people aren't building it and there's value. It's just that people aren't actually sort of focusing on the hype as much as it's on the fundamentals. And that's actually how I look at the state of Web3 gaming and NFTs as well, right? And so meaning that actually the growth continues. Actually, Web3 games, when you talk about number of users, is actually bigger than ever when it talks about the number of people in there. Sure, market cap might not be tens of billions of dollars per project as some projects were at one point. But let's be real here. I don't think many of these projects actually are necessarily worth that much. The fact that these ecosystems are worth billions of dollars today is frankly still mind-blowingly good. I mean, let's just like if you put it into perspective, it's like, it's like saying, oh, shucks, we didn't list this token. It's not worth $10 billion. What? It's like, seriously, like what planet are you on when you think it has to be worth just because it was a value? Like it's kind of like looking at .com back in the day and expecting every project thereafter to have that value, right? And so I think we need to separate sort of the hype cycle and then the fundamental side. And what's fundamental?
Yeah,
Well, the
one second though.
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say, because I think for some of our listeners who might be a little younger, we did have that, right? When like anything with a .com in the late 90s was value 10x what it should have been, only because there was so much hype. This is not a new cycle.
Well, how about real estate in 2008?
Well, that's it as well, right?
I mean,
yeah. But I think you just make a great point, which I think is just because the hype, because people are so excited about the technology, does not mean the true value is there. You still have to prove out the value.
Correct. And I think when you take a look at, for instance, I mean, even back in the early, in the sort of the end of the .com era, as it were, there were tons of articles out there basically talking about the death of the internet, and nobody cares about it, right?
Yes.
And in fact, frankly, that's when companies like Amazon or NetEase or Tencent, and these are companies that simply weren't worth that much, were the opportunities. And again, I kind of look at it in that same lens. But let's sort of talk a little bit about sort of the state of the industry. Sure, the state of the industry isn't at peak, but again, we can't look at peak necessarily as a way to measure where things are. When you think about the evolution of NFTs over the last, really, when you talk about sort of 4 or 5 years, it was effectively a $0 industry. I mean, we barely hit $1 million of total volume in, like, I think 2018, and a couple million in 2019. And today, despite everything, the run rate is roughly $10 billion, but it's become much more fragmented. So remember, the reason why the attention was the way that it was in 21 is because Bored Apes, as in Yuga Labs, actually represented 90% of the market. And there was really only one marketplace, which was OpenSea, that actually represented 99% of the volume. So it was very easy to measure that. You could just look at one platform and one product and say, that's it. However, today, between Ordinals and Solana, what's happening on all the other chains, it's far more fragmented, for instance, right? And so the result is that collectively, you still have a lot of value, but it's more distributed. That doesn't mean that Bored Apes aren't as valuable in terms of its status as they were before. They're just not as concentrated, right? We see that effect happening in any maturation of the market, which means actually, frankly, I think it's a better opportunity for new platforms to emerge. For instance, if you're launching an NFT project, you can make good money. Doesn't mean you have to make billions, right? But and to me, this is also like kind of like how gaming, right? In the early days of gaming, frankly, any game did really well. And then as more games emerged, the quality of the games became more important, and the ones who had better quality started to reach on the top. And so platforms like Telegram and Ton provide distribution vectors that didn't exist before. So that's kind of the other part of the growth. So we have millions and millions of more end users when you look at what's happening on Ton, and when you look at on-chain activity. The number one activity is actually Web3 games. A lot of people don't want to talk about Axie anymore, but Axie is doing well. It's actually revived quite well. The Ronin blockchain is one of the most active gaming chains, with Pixels and other products that are out there. It's actually doing well, but it's kind of a non-story, if you know what I mean, right? It's like, oh, well, we've written that story or we've heard about it. Let's move on. And, oh, there's this shiny new thing called AI. Let's talk about that, for instance, and how that's sort of disrupting everything, even though it continues to have major impacts in places like Vietnam and the Philippines, right? So I think there's that. So the silent building is important, though, because once value starts building as they do, eventually it's something that you can't ignore. So I think that's what's happening. The other thing is, NFT projects. Again, one thing also I think we have to appreciate is that the Web3 world is a world of its own. So while it does connect with people from the physical world, most of the capital flows that are happening in the space comes from people who made money in Web3. That is not that different from how sort of new economies emerge, like a new country like China has a new wealth class, or even new segments of an industry. For instance, Silicon Valley 40 years ago. Silicon Valley 40 years ago was not a wealth class, and today it is the biggest wealth class in America, right? Disrupting what was traditionally the finance class. And so we see this division also in places like the US, where you look at places like Miami, which is essentially crypto capital of America, which really a lot of the wealth that's in Web3 is new wealth that didn't come from established wealth coming in. So they're buying different things, they have different cultures. So it's a different growth market, right? And so as that market goes on growing, actually, what are the sort of network and sort of status assets that they're going to look for? These are things like NFTs, for instance, that mean something to them in the same way that for certain generations, it was a Birkin bag or a Rolex or a Lamborghini or a Ferrari.
Some of us are still on that Birkin game, Yacht. So, everyone gets to pick their poison, their investment vehicle.
Yes. Well, remember, the investment side, when someone buys a status object like a Birkin bag, they're not investing in it for its utility. They're not even investing because they want to sell it right away. Some do, right? You have traders. Most is because the sort of, as we describe also network effects, is they emanate a membership in the network that they're in that gives them a status that's more meaningful to them. And I think, to me, when I look at NFTs, there's the intellectual property right, that's a utility. But actually, I think the more powerful thing about NFTs is that they essentially personify symbolic, cultural, and social capital. And most of the game that we're currently playing in Web3, which is the evolution we're in, like with meme coins, for instance, is the economic stage, right? So, you might call it speculation, you might call it gambling, but it's still the economic stage of that evolution, which to me is a representation of the world that we're in right now. Basically a world that's broadly more inequitable than it was, say, even 5 years ago, certainly pre-COVID, right? And so people are sort of in that space, but then when they start making value, then they do things that sort of elevate their status in a different way. It's kind of like, once you have a certain amount of money, how do I differentiate? And how do I sort of have my sort of cultural capital versus others? That's what people look at. What degree do I have? What experience have I had? What assets do I own? How am I a little different? And as you mentioned, Avery, for some it's the Birkin bag or the Picassos, and for others it's the CryptoPunks and the Bored Apes, Mochaverse, or Pudgy Penguins, that type of category.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm feeling very pumped up about this conversation. I feel like I'm a big believer in this. And just to sort of sum up what I'm hearing from you, it's like history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. You see a lot of sort of parallels and trends of things that you've seen in your previous investing career. And, you're actually remain really bullish on this space. And there's a lot of good that's happening, even that's not necessarily being shared out. You said something that I want to double click on. You mentioned NFTs as they relate to intellectual property rights. And you've shared a little bit about sort of your thinking on that across social media. I'd love to understand that, because that's something that we heard a lot about in sort of the 2021 era. And I think it's cooled off quite a bit. I'd love to hear how you and the Animoca companies are thinking about NFTs as containers for IP rights.
Yeah. So, generally we think of NFTs as containers of culture, which means intellectual property rights, because intellectual property rights really is, if you think about it, it is a property of our mind, right? It is a thing that we can't hold. It's something that we've created, whether it's a patent, an idea, or something like that. And so I often sort of tell people, imagine what the music industry would be like if there was no intellectual property protection. Well, there would be no Taylor Swift, there would be no Michael Jackson, there would be no libraries, the Beatles wouldn't exist. All these things wouldn't be possible. And so how much of human potential, creativity, and interest and love and passion would be lost, actually, unless we were able to protect these type of intellectual property rights, right? So I think we can agree on that, broadly speaking. This is true for film, it's true for arts, it's all that kind of stuff. The problem, though, is that the current legal infrastructure doesn't allow for the intellectual property rights protection of everything. It only allows it really for the 1%. Meaning, if I make a certain amount of revenue, or if it has worth a certain amount of asset, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year at least, then I can hire a lawyer, or I can trademark it, I can do all these things, right? And so that means we're really only protecting, effectively, assets of a certain class. But we're not able to protect everything broadly, because that framework couldn't exist before blockchain. Now, with NFTs, you can actually protect everything, because the cost is basically $1 or less, because you can prove it. So, there's some very sort of whimsical examples, like when we back Dance Fight. It's not a big business, but it's kind of cool, because basically dancers who readily put their dance moves out in things like TikTok basically can now protect their dance moves, because, in the US, you don't have to have a trademark on your move. You just have to show that you did it first. And, his story was, hey, he made a dance move, and then he discovered that it was ripped off basically by Epic in an emote of Fortnite. And it's like, wait, this is my favorite game, just stole my moves. And he wrote back and said, hey, that's my move. Can we do? And basically it was like, no, you didn't invent that. And he can't prove it because he has no way of doing it. And so that to me is kind of where NFTs become interesting. We're doing this with teachers. So teachers have created content where they create educational content that actually can create yield. That yield would be rented off to other students for like $10 or $20 a year. It's not a lot. But now as an intellectual property right, you can capitalize that, right? And that you can now sell for, I don't know, 3 times, 5 times, whatever. And that is not just potential in the West, actually. It's an incredible potential in places that don't have property rights anyway. We're talking about places like Venezuela or Colombia or like certain countries in Southeast Asia where people make very little money to begin with. But if you can start capitalizing its value, then actually you can start selling it off as a property right. That's how wealth begins. And that's actually the story of wealth in the West. I own an asset. I finally was able to own my land or my house. And now someone bought it for some value because since I owned it and there was a stable government that assured that I could pass it on because it's a freehold, for instance, then I can actually give it a 20-year value. And that was the type of stuff that created wealth. And it's the reason how people who had nothing started to have something, right? Property rights. And so to us, that's what NFTs really represent. Because of course, tokens are a way to own network effects of these ecosystems, but they're broad, right? They're not unique. The containers of these things are unique to each individual. I would argue that humans generally have the potential to create all sorts of intellectual property, property rights. And one of the fascinating things is that, we have this capacity, and with AI, we're going to create even more type of sort of intellectual property faster than ever before. And in many ways, the AI, if you look at OpenAI, it's basically scraping data from everything around the world, making it its own, and giving zero value back to the people it's taken the data from, which actually I think of one way to look at it is probably the biggest intellectual property theft of all time in some ways. And so the result, I think, is that what's the system that can say, hey, I took this information from 100,000 different sources, and now I'm going to give value back. Well, it's blockchain. I can give you an airdrop or token reward for having used your sources. And I can also mark my data to say, please use my sources freely as long as you give me X percentage of whatever value you make. And that can all be proved through the provenance on blockchain, right? That's the future. And that's kind of how we get to a point where all of us have intellectual property rights protection of some form.
So what I'm hearing is if we had been able to tokenize Brat Summer, we would all be doing very well right now. But really we would have the provenance chain of origination. And, it reminds me, and I feel like this entire podcast has been me talking about how old I am. But like, I remember being a kid and people saying, oh, if you have an idea, write it on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope and send it to yourself. Because then you would get the postmark date, and then you could prove that you had done something early. And like, it was very early, right? The idea of copyright. And now we're in a state where people can spin up these ideas in seconds. You mentioned dogs earlier on Ton. I'm thinking about Dog with Hat on Solana. I do think though, and this is a question that came up. I was talking with a prolific investor in the art space, and he just said to me, and I want to pose the same question to you. He's like, it feels like people are more focused on tokenization than innovation right now. And in the sense that because Kamala had the DNC last week, so suddenly the Kamala coins are pumping, and then Trump said this, and then Trump's coin is pumping. And, these are coins and or chains that are not really adding a lot of innovation value. All they're doing is like playing trend. So as someone I think who invests a lot on the technology side and understands the technology side, where do you stand on the idea of which is more important, the idea of tokenization or building innovation on top of that?
Well, I think they're both equally important because at the end of the day, when you think about the source and the root of innovation, it mostly happens for whimsical reasons, right? And I think that's kind of one of the amazing things about us as humans is like, what did the Stone Age people do when they started sorting out food? They started drawing shit on caves, and then they made musical instruments out of bones. Really? like of all the things you could be thinking of, you're doing something that creates pleasure in your life. And that's the thing, right? As humans, we seek happiness and we seek some form of validation of our feelings, right? That's the thing that does differ us from machines, right? We look for these whimsical things. So to me, meme coins, dog with hat, dogs, whatever. They're fun, they're crazy, they're stupid as well. But you know what? What do we do most of the time on the internet, right? So I kind of look at sort of the parallel I see with meme coins. And by the way, platforms like Pump.fun have essentially launched something like 2 million meme coins over the last couple of months or something crazy like that. So, which I think puts out a different challenge. But the way I look at it is not that different from, chat rooms and message boards and those type of things back in the early days of CompuServe and later on essentially with the internet. I mean, what is Reddit? From my perspective, Reddit is sub-communities that effectively tokens are representations of these networks, right? So I love cats. Here's a token. I love Kamala. Here's a token. Here's Trump, 10 different ways. Here's a token. That's not that different from having, 1,000 different chat rooms emerging. What are they doing? Trying to draw attention to their particular chat room. The difference, of course, is because it's tokens, there's a financial effect that didn't really exist before. But underlying, there was always a network effect around that. It's just hadn't had a way in which you could translate its financial value. But if you actually look at even something like a Reddit subgroup, there is a financial value in it. It's just you could never measure it before. And so tokens represent that imperfectly, I would say, but it is a way of doing that. So we're going through these evolutions. But the reason why I'm so bullish about NFTs is that at the end of the day, NFTs are the unique provenance of something. So for instance, my perspective is that, a CryptoPunk or Bored Ape, despite all its controversies, have a lasting legacy around this. Because if you're believing in Web3, then grabbing one of those guys will be not just valuable, it'll be special. I mean, most people won't want to sell them anymore in the same way that, hey, I want a Picasso. I don't want to sell that either. If I happen to want to learn Leonardo da Vinci, I don't want to sell that at all, because there's something meaningful or powerful behind that story and that legacy, because I was there for the birth of that sort of moment, or I own a piece of that history, right? That's kind of what that means. And so I would say, to me, because of the added complexity, which is more natural to us as humans, NFTs represent it much stronger. But we're at a phase of that development which is economic. And it's a little bit like in the early days of the internet, when you had blogs emerge everywhere and you have chat rooms emerge everywhere, and everyone is building basically the same stuff, right? And then eventually they peter out, and then they start focusing on the things that are more uniquely valuable. And that's actually where NFTs will really begin to shine. And those are the cultural objects that mean something to us individually, right? So I think I'm very bullish on NFTs, but I think the meme coin sort of cultural phenomena is a necessary step in the evolution of where we are. Which, by the way, on that topic, I think it's diluting attention on a lot of tokens broadly, right? I mean, before, if you didn't have millions of meme coins out there, then you'd have a lot more attention on other tokens. And I think that's what we're seeing in the market. And so the difference is I also think we're entering an institutional age of essentially Web3. So the flag banner carrier was basically ETFs. But really, if you think about if institutions hold your token, they represent essentially the stronger, let's call it network power, in the same way that the equities market is 80% institution. And in crypto, it's kind of the other way around for the time being, right? So the tokens that have institutional support are going to be the ones that have different attention versus the broader retail side, unless retail grows as fast as the number of meme coins out there, which it's not, right? So consequently, you'll have more of a dilution effect. And that's why I think sort of new token launches haven't had the success they've had, for instance, early in the year versus they are today, because essentially you're cycling through the same audiences without institutional support. So I think people need to start looking at who's backing it, who's behind it. Is it an institution? Is it institutional grade? These are things that I think will begin being part of the conversation in Web3 that really wasn't before.
Wow. Honestly, I could probably listen to you talk all day. Very inspiring, very interesting. And, I think your perspective is one that a lot of our listeners will really enjoy and it will really resonate with them. And I feel like this has been, 40 minutes of you sort of giving your pitch on Web3. But if you had to just trim it to like 60 seconds of converting a skeptic to imagine you're speaking to a Web3 skeptic who's like, all this stuff is crap. Like Bored Apes imploded. Yacht, like, why should I believe in this Web3 ecosystem? What would be your elevator pitch to them?
Well, my elevator pitch really for anyone who's a critic or skeptic of Web3 is you need to own the network effects of your data. And the only way to do that is Web3. I would say that's it. And then we can start explaining to them what is a network effect. But that's basically all the value that these platforms give out. I think one of the things that resonate a lot of people is I tell people who don't understand what we're doing, we say, did you know you're working for Instagram for free? And I think a lot of people go, what? And then you explain them how they make money and how they create value. And then they start thinking, oh, that's not right. And by the way, that's why I'm somewhat bullish on the Telegram conversation, because that elevates this conversation that is now on everyone's lips that essentially nobody was really talking about.
And I would say, yeah, just to put a pin in that too, I mean, your example is great. The example I've been using is a very silly game around collecting points around hamsters went from no one to 50 million users in essence 4 to 6 weeks. And you show them the game and they're like, this is the stupidest game. And then they start playing it. And then now they've been playing it for 3 weeks, like, so I think that is exactly the right thing, which is we don't talk about crypto there in the same way we don't talk about crypto when we're using Blackbird to make a restaurant payment.
Yes.
But the fact is you're using crypto at that point, and we just don't have to talk about it. And I think that is where I start to get excited that more abstraction that's coming, and gaming is to me the perfect way to think of abstraction also,
Yes.
is how we succeed in this. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We can't wait to see you in Hong Kong and everywhere else you're going to be. I'm sure you have a busy fall, but thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Yat. Take care. Sam, I was already looking forward to having Yat on, but that conversation, it really exceeded my expectations. Let's say that.
Absolutely. I interviewed him at Consensus this year in a very open live. We didn't have a lot of agenda. We just kind of started to chop it up with Leah Callan Butler, who's also a gaming person out of Asia. And just the depth of insight and thought. I think Yat is also one of the best spokespeople for the Web3 space, as someone who has done very well across all of this. I will say 540 portfolio companies, though, that was shocking.
And that's not it. He said that was just the start.
Right. I'm just imagining the spreadsheet that has to track all of these, and my ADD goes crazy.
Quote of the episode was definitely, he likes to sprinkle some cash around. I liked that. I'm going to sprinkle some cash.
Yeah, we got to sprinkle some cash. All right, Gen C, we hope you love this episode. We're, very excited to have Yat Siu on. Yat is one of those people you should be following who is so insightful and thoughtful on the space. We hope you liked it as much as we did.